How's it going, folks? Thank you for being here. You're watching the first episode ever of the Jaxlabs podcast. In particular, this is the cognitive physics edition. I think in the future we'll be talking about other topics as time progresses, but right now our focus is entirely about cognitive physics and the system of the substrate of energy dynamics in cognitive systems, particularly, natural cognitive systems. This episode's all about a topic we are all familiar with, but more about how this sort of thing can expand into identity. And the idea is pain as an identity. And honestly, the core intention really is this episode is not per se about trauma stories or some sort of like vapid motivation or platitude. It's really about a more intense understanding. I don't know if intense is exactly the right word, but an overarching understanding of how pain shapes us as people, from the role we play in archetype, the psychological implications and the patterns that cluster, the neurological perspective and standpoint, and lastly with the cognitive physics / substrate aspect of it. And you have to forgive me, I'm actually a bit under the weather, which is why I sound kind of stuffy. So forgive me there. Cognitive physics as a whole is about structure. It's not about one feeling or sensation or another so much. It's about how we operate and how all systems operate. And the idea of cognitive physics is what are the known invariants and constraints that are proposed in a cognitive system to maintain equilibrium, to maintain its structure. And tomorrow's episode on this channel here on YouTube will refer to this topic in a wider array of cases, but more of a condensed understanding. If you're subscribed to the Substack, which I know you are, if you're also hearing this because this is released on the Substack, you will notice that we have a technical paper attached every Friday. This Friday in particular about the exact same subject we're talking about now. And if you're really made of the good stuff, that's the best way I could say it, you'll also be a member in school.com. That's SKOOL.com. It's a place where you can learn curriculum, go to classes about specific topics that interest you. I host a class on cognitive physics. There's to join the community, it's free. To be a part of the membership and to have access to the curriculum is a monthly fee. But I can assure you it's worth it. There's a lot of work being put into it to make sure you guys have the best possible information. And it's been a long time reaching this point. 10 years really in total. And so I'm really happy to be bringing this sort of thing to the forefront. Without further ado, more about the point. So most advice fails often because it misunderstands what pain actually does to a system and what it does to a person. Not just in semantics or like in a very casual way, but what it really is doing and how it's altering a person. And so everyone has different tolerances or different ideas about how to deal with pain and things of that nature. But we often treat it the wrong way. We tend to treat pain as something that should just go away, like it'll just dissipate. In a lot of cases, our experiences may revolve around that. There's no one mood or experience you will consistently have without it alternating between one or the other. So when we see the sensation of what is a conscious pain dissipates, that we think that the attachment of that pain has gone away as well. But some pain does not. And when it doesn't, your system adapts. And you'll be familiar with pains that don't just fade away if you think about a context of a situation and you still feel a heavy twinge, there's a good chance that there's been a small rewiring, or a scar, as we often will call them. So when pain doesn't leave, the system doesn't just pause. It's forced to reorganize, right? And this isn't about why people won't change. It's more about why often they can't without the right motivation. But more importantly, the right motivation is not a bunch of words and insight you'll get. The motivation comes from helping your own system to adapt. You have to sort of, like physical therapy, work your way through it. And there's a few ways to do it, and we'll get into those ways. Not just what we all think is, oh, therapy. It's like, well, we can get precise here, and that's really what matters. By the end of this, we'll have more compassion and more precision, and we could all use a little bit of that. So let's talk about the thing that persists, which is really the phenomenon. So let's talk about the type of pain we're talking about here. The idea is we want to distinguish acute pain versus persistent pain. And acute pain could be anything. We're familiar with it. You stub your toe, you have a headache, something happens, an injury. That's an acute pain where your system is telling you, hey, there's something wrong in this particular area that needs our attention. Let's supply, physical resources to this area. And your body will do that. It'll supply resources to the area of your body that is in need, right? To heal that wound. But in our experiences, there's pain as well. Emotional pain. And if it's persistent and it begins to build itself into a reoccurring pattern, that drastically changes how your body reacts to this. Sort of how your body really can react. You understand? And so persistent pain eventually, like all things that are persistent, become a background condition, meaning that it's operating in your mind and in your psyche, and it's forced to remain because it has no ability to close the loop. And most problems on the planet, especially when it comes to your body, is really just a loop that is not being closed, a loop that is not being parsed together. There is either can't reach its equilibrium, it's over propagating in one side or the other, right? Or it's under propagating because it needs energy. All of that, and all systems that are enclosed are looped. They're recursive. They build upon one another. They expand, they contract, and they reset. All physical systems and all systems in reality expand, contract, and reset. So when you apply that model to cognition and you look at our problems to that model, it makes it a lot more comprehensive as to what you need to do next. So when pain becomes constant, it stops being an event and becomes your environment, right? And at that point, behavior is not about relief. It's about stability. And that's what your body is always trying to do, provide stability. So at some point, it stops being something you're just sensationally feeling and something that you begin to live within. And that's when it becomes a problem. The system stops asking, how do I make this go away? It starts asking, how do I not fall apart? How do we maintain while this persists in our lives? If you think about Stockholm Syndrome, this is something that is a mental effect that in a unstable environment with an oppressor, a tyrant, or a situation that is causing consistent pain, your body feels the need to stabilize itself in this condition. Because the body is incredible. The mind is incredible. It's adaptable. All enclosed systems have to have this ability. The adaptability is the expansion and contraction among multiple areas and delegation of energetic resources. But if a system has no choice but to digest and metabolize a consistent painful experience, it shapes your identity. And without making light of the subject, we picked a very known, and this example, this one is a fictional one because it reaches a wide array of audiences because everyone's familiar with this person. And each example we present among podcasts, among our curriculum, will be for a wide array of individuals, whether they're fictional or historical or modern, or, we run the gambit so that people can get a full synopsis of the kind of individuals you encounter and how it shows up for them. And this is not a one size fit all. It's more about, here's how this variable isolated in this individual shows up that is relatively consistent to some degree for a large majority of the population. Even if this is a hyperbolic expression of this phenomenon, it's still relatable. And we're talking about the comic book character of Batman, a personal favorite of mine, but I think he's the number one known comic book character on the world, next to Spider-Man. I think Batman's number one. And if you notice, for those of you who don't know or who are not familiar with Batman's origin story, I'll give you a brief synopsis here. He was a wealthy kid born by these two good parents, not just wealthy parents. They were actually good parents, provided a lot of emotional stability for him. And they were reasonable, they were kind. And a tragedy happened when he was really young in his early development years. I think somewhere between ages of 9 and 12. It varies depending on the canonical stories you're watching. He was leaving this theater with his parents. They went through the alleyway. A mugger appears, looking for their wallet. This is, just had no real reason besides something very common, just looking for money for, drugs or whatever it may be, right? He frantically ends up shooting both of his parents in front of the young Batman, aka Bruce Wayne, and this scars the kid. And he decides in that moment that he is going to create the most amount of meaning he can to this tragic event in order to prevent himself from collapsing. And you'll see interesting other fictional characters who have similar experiences, and I might get into those later. Like Bruce Banner, who is the Hulk, is another example of someone who had a similar experience. But this is not what that's about. Perhaps later we'll get into that. Let me know if that's something you'd like to, hear an archetypal dive on. And so this individual, Bruce Wayne, goes and makes his whole life mission around eradicating crime in this one city, this Gotham City. And in reality, he's trying to be the ultimate force of control, right? And it's an attempt, really, to provide stability to him, his younger self, in his internal emotional landscape. He's trying to find a way out of what seems to be a not just unfair, but a situation that really doesn't have an equilibrium itself, because the amount of which his parents impacted his life ended in a way that is not reconcilable. This person didn't even have malicious intent. There wasn't it wasn't directed at his parents or to cause harm to Bruce. It was just a random tragic event where this individual wants resources, wrong place, wrong time for his parents, and this is the reaction, right? And so our minds, when trying to deal with things like that we don't feel like we have justification for, we will often attach the pain to a certain type of meaning. And then that is the beginning of a process that sort of takes root and expands across your entire experience in your life. especially considering a pain like this does not easily go away for anyone. And when you're a child, you have less tools than any to deal with situations like this. So you're forced to derive your own narrative. And when it starts internal, that's the framing, right? So if you look at Batman, the character, as an adult, what is he, right? He's a very dark character. He literally embodies his biggest fear. And his biggest fear is really, even though the bats, quote unquote, are the thing he was most afraid of, it was really the connection between the safety that his parents provided that now is gone away. So he's in this dark alley. This metaphorically speaking, the mind and his heart could be this new alley where he has never really escaped that situation. He never really left that alley. A part of him dies there, and a new part is born that is sort of his new protective force that his parents left behind, and he has to now embody that. And he does it in a way that is fractionated from himself. He literally wears a costume and a mask to fractionate himself. And he talks about how he's separate from the character. He's not Bruce Wayne anymore. He's Batman, because he takes on this idea of control in this fear, so that he is absorbing the darkness, not because he likes darkness. It started off with hating, and he still hates it, but he has to embody it as a sense of control. We call that responsibility anchoring. That's right. Responsibility increases instead of decreases when you go through a trauma. And it's not the trauma, it's how is the body dealing with pain, a persistent pain. Vigilance instead now becomes hyperactive. The role persists even when alternatives exist. Could he have taken his infrastructure and his parents' legacy and his intelligence and all these things and created a pathway, whether it's through law or through some sort of organization, and opened up the door? What if all crime ceased, what would happen to him? Would he lose his reasons and his stability and his intention as this role he's taken on? And repeatedly throughout various depictions, you see that that's the case, right? So the psychological framing, not of Batman, but of what is happening in the mind when this kind of thing is encountered, when you have a persistent pain that is introduced and requires a processing, and others will process pain more effectively than others, right? So what is the situation that is first, right? Meaning is assigned. Meaning under persistent pain, because humans cannot tolerate meaningless suffering, right? So when pain persists, meaning becomes a stabilizing force for this feeling that feels destabilizing, right? Meaning isn't optimism, it's coherence. Meaning is what keeps pain from becoming chaotic and chaos as a whole. Responsibility is the second piece. Responsibility is the psychological glue for meaning. Responsibility provides control, and control restores predictability. Your brain is constantly assessing reality and taking an experience, and similar to how neural networks like AIs and LLMs are built, they are looking to anticipate what the next thing will be. Your brain is doing this. And oftentimes when it predicts incorrectly, there is a signal to prune the directional pattern it absorbed and to take a different direction, right? And for those who are hyper responsible, which can be a trauma response, or it oftentimes can be a natural proclivity towards the person's personality outside of these responses, this responsibility provides a measure of control, which then restores predictability, which then allows the brain to have the sensation of stabilization. They think, if I'm responsible, the world still makes sense. Responsibility in this case is not virtuous or moral. It's just a pure stability-based module, you could say, a modum operandum. And we'll talk later about why stability is the biggest aspect here, according to the cognitive physics lens. Responsibility feels heavy, but it's often lighter than helplessness. The third thing, our C, is identity formation. Role, repetition, self-concept. This is how you get archetypes. The guilt from the experiences becomes regulatory. It's not a moral guilt. It's a guilt to maintain the structure of fighting, pushing beyond, accomplishing and maintaining the stability. Otherwise, it feels shaky. Rest feels wrong in this individual. The role stops being something you do, and it just starts becoming who you are as a person. This is your character now. That's the psychological framing. The neuroscientific framing is this. Number one, pain is the threat signal, right? Pain is salience plus threat, not emotion. Emotion is after pain, right? Pain is like an alarm system. And sooner or later, your ears tone out anything that is, even if it's loud, sooner or later it begins to tone it out, right? That's how your brain's designed. And pain is a signal that begins to become ignored as well. And it's not so much that it's ignored, it's that it's qualified and delegated to behavioral tasks, to maintain stability. A chronic pain is a persistent threat signaling. So if you're experiencing persistent threat signaling, your baseline will shift. The brain is going to recalibrate and redesign what normal will feel like for you, for that person. The amygdala and the prefrontal cortex share a dynamic. The amygdala becomes anticipatory, anticipating experiences. Your prefrontal cortex flexibility decreases. And the prefrontal cortex more or less is the theater of your mind. It's filtering and taking in conscious understanding. It's also what provides you with the ability to abstract, right? The amygdala is assimilated with threat response and emotional responses to experience. And so it makes sure in a neurotypical fashion that your system will prioritize certainty over exploration, because exploration will seem dangerous to your system based on the lack of control with anticipatory reactions and responses. And the flexibility being decreased in the prefrontal cortex means that you have more of a rigid structure. You'll notice too, just a tangent, psychopathic brain wiring often has a lack of connection, has a decreased reaction in the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, which is also why they're not future oriented, being that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for that, along with other things. And the amygdala doesn't help them retrain their brain according to pain and sensations. So when they experience a bad sensation, the amygdala, the neurotypical brain, will then reflect on that and respond by altering the path. Whereas in the psychopathic brain, they continue to maintain and to divulge the same behavior because this response to pain is more muted, which is why for lower intelligent, often psychopathic or sociopathic individuals, they end up in correction facilities. You realize the brain doesn't actually optimize for growth under threat. It really optimizes for survival. And so in a neurotypical brain, the survival is the main edge. In a non-neurotypical brain, like we mentioned with the psychopathic brain, even though this is not about that, their brain doesn't grow under threat because it's not optimizing even for survival. They even have a lack of self-compassion. It's not just lack of empathy for others, it's an apathy for oneself. That's the impairment. You'll notice that, which shows up as fearless dominance and much of other things. Obviously, that's not what we're talking about, but you'll see the contrast here, right? The last thing, according to the neuroscientific aspect, is what we call a learning bias, right? Your brain is looking for confirmation constantly about its belief systems, its anticipatory reactions to stimuli, its patterns. All that creates what we call a cognitive bias, right? And we love to feed our cognitive biases because it rewards us. And in situations where you have to be objective, it can become rather difficult. How that is revolved around pain is that stress hormones reinforce vigilance, right? Stress hormones reinforce vigilance, which is create what we call a neurotic behavior in people who are not experiencing external threats, but their internal landscape is constantly simulating stress hormones. And so they're constantly hypervigilant emotionally. That's neuroticism. Stillness increases noise. Stillness increases noise, and that seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? But it's more about how your system is consistently used to metabolizing stimuli. And then last but not least, control substitutes for safety. So instead of actually opting for real safety, you opt for control, because that provides the reward circuitry which is reduced because the prefrontal cortex also is affiliated with reward circuitry, like dopamine releases through the nucleus accumbens, right? Flooding your prefrontal cortex, creating neuronal pathways. All of these are inhibited when you're having a consistent pain response. And so your control is a substitute for safety due to this lack of natural reward stimuli, along with how your brain is searching for stability. And so it becomes this reinforcing loop. One reinforces the other. And that's why rest feels uncomfortable. That's why peace feels uncomfortable, because you're constantly looking for where is the threat. Peace is a sign of threat to you in your neurological makeup, because your brain has rewired itself in a capacity and in a way that is constantly signaling and looking and anticipating threat. So you're in a situation where you're at rest, or you're at calm, or you're at peace, the threat signals skyrocket because it's consistently also aware of how the pain initially began, which is you were unsuspecting, you were not anticipating it. And in situations like that, it's because you're also comfortable. So when you're most comfortable, your brain tells you this is the highest potential for threat. We need to be hypervigilant and even more controlling in this context. And so it reinforces the loop, and you never reach that sort of stillness with any sort of longing peace. It's just because the system lost its reference frame for accurate reality. This is the bias. Now, from a cognitive physics reductive standpoint, to highlight how A looks in cognitive physics, which is coordination capacity. So, pain, threats, the brain signaling, psychological meaning, all this is reduced to three things as a substrate. The first thing, once again, I mentioned is coordination capacity. Coordination has a finite capacity, meaning you only have so much energy for delegation as a system. And a system as trying to maintain stability has to relegate and delegate energy in the correct ways to your body, to your brain, to these responses. Persistent pain occupies a lot of bandwidth. This is like having what we call RAM, which is random access memory. It's constantly flooding the mind with persistent bias and anticipatory reactions to potentially negative stimuli, even without a negative stimuli present. And so that operates a lot of bandwidth to constantly be in a fight or flight. Options collapse in that moment because there's too much load. The energy of this bandwidth occupies way too much energy, collapsing aspects of potential variability that would allow your brain to reroute, as we know about the path of least resistance. This is a similar behavior with PTSD. Once again, this is not about trauma as a whole. This is about how does the system function? And how does the system in your mind, how does your cognition system, which is an enclosed system, function that forces these invariants, that forces your neurological reactions, that forces psychological behavior and clustering, that forces archetypal and role at the surface level. All these behaviors are based on how a system is forced to constitute itself. You don't lose options and choices to change because you don't want them. You lose them because they exceed the capacity you have. There is a way out of this, but this is important to understand. Just pushing through it is not enough because you're exceeding your capacity. And when you exceed capacity, you collapse and you revert back to relapse. That's why so many people relapse when it comes to drugs, because drugs have a supernatural response and a superlinear response in your brain to reward stimuli. And then often it's absorbed, things like opioids. It's absorbed into the system to the point where the reaction is deafened. But the desire, the seeking of this flush of behavior is still prominent, you see. B, identity. Identity under the cognitive physics framework. Identity is equilibrium. A coherent structure maintains a balance. Even if it's unbalanced, it maintains balance with an imbalance. That's how amazingly well-formed your system is, that you are as a person, as a complex structure. It's not a preference. It's not a narrative, right? Your identity in itself, you believe, is I'm Irish, or I'm from Italy, or I'm American, my father this and my mother that. Absolutely, environment will have an account on how your behavior stabilizes itself over time, but so much of it is about how a system itself has to maintain stability. A lot of this also, genetically speaking or prenatally speaking, can sort of orchestrate itself in different directions. In other videos, in other podcasts going forward, we'll get into this as well. But we'll stay in the scope of our conversation here. It's not a preference. It's not a narrative you're feeding yourself. It's just stability over optimization, right? Identity is where the system settles so it doesn't break. Okay? You don't have to feel guilty, but you do have to be aware. And if you're aware, we can now help you to have compassion for yourself, compassion for others, and give you a plan of attack. The exit conditions, the plan of attack. You either have to do a few things here. You have to reduce the load, or AKA reduce the coordination capacity that your brain is spending on fear responses and threat stimuli. And you do that by actions, by reinforcing yourself, sort of dipping your toe in water. Like, say if you had a phobia of water, you would slowly reintroduce water into your life. And then over time, it stops producing so much threat responses, and it stops allocating so much energy towards that. Honestly, it's better to take a compounded effect towards overcoming a habit, overcoming an addiction, changing your identity. These things often are better done in pairs or in compounded effects. That's just one of many. The second thing you can do is expand your capacity. How do you expand capacity? Same procedure, different process. It's not so much of forcing slowly gradual building on one small thing as much as it is expanding what you can handle by reducing how much energy you have in your life overall. So you reduce the amount of interaction or amount of load that your brain has to experience by reducing the amount of stimuli. And then with that time you have, you slowly re-alternate your identity by introducing on a small scale things that are less frightening. It's not always conscious things that you're frightening of. It's how your brain's responding to it, right? So you live your life in a way that you're not feeding the same neuronal pathways that are giving that sort of stimuli. And that sort of requires sitting in the fire a bit. Anything else will cause collapse. So really it's just the two things that you can focus on in a myriad of ways. But you reduce the load gradually. Do not jump. Cold turkey is often very much worse because your brain is looking for a transition to maintain stability. If you do not give it that, it collapses. If you've seen Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom, the first one, if you haven't, I'll explain it. but he's an archaeological explorer, and he goes into a cave and he looks for a relic that's worth a lot of money, and it also opens up ways to information towards things he's already sort of diving into. He finally reaches the cave, which is booby trapped. He's got plenty of threats there, darts and poison this and arrows and knives and giant boulders coming out, right? And his goal is to not trigger the final one by replacing the artifact with something of congruent weight. And he does it, but it still triggers it because it's like double encrypted or whatever, But the idea here is you have to replace it for yourself. That way, you have something that is actually stable for your identity to latch onto, and it's a productive thing. You don't want to pick something that is going to give you, trade out a freezing cold for a burning hot. You want to trade out something that's actually going to be useful for you and help you move forward. And that's a process of its own. And also, releasing the capacity is also sort of taking the pressure valve off. Awareness and talking it out will help in therapy, but really action is the biggest thing. You have to change slowly the habits that your brain is anticipating and the reactions and consciously reframing so that you'll be able to work your way through this. You'll be able to actually get out of it. Anything else, once again, collapses. You do it slowly, gradually. You say, it takes time, it's too long, blah, blah, blah. The time will go by whether you like it or not, and either you could change and be changed for the better and not let your identity and your fear be linked, or you could live the rest of your life just the way you have. I'm sure it's been going amazing. Or else you wouldn't be here, right? It's inevitable. So this is how we reframe the idea of endurance. Type A people or individuals who are self-sacrificing to a degree that is unhealthy, or people who are, whatever fear you have that's irrational, that is, whether you're aware of it or not, is just a response to this threat, to this irrational threat your brain was naturally looking for it, and it became reinforced because it was a weak spot already. And then it began to be exacerbated, whether that's through trauma or experience. Whatever it may be, it's something that you can work through. And it takes time, but it's worth it. Timing matters. Okay? So be reasonable, be modest. You often will harm yourself more often than help if you try to, if you've never lifted a weight, you don't want to go to the gym and lift 350 pounds, for your first rep. You're going to hurt yourself. You want to gradually build up. And there's no moral judgment on here. We're just trying to, so stop being so hard on yourself and guilty. This is about moving forward, right? And that's a positive thing. Once you see this, you stop asking why some people don't change, and you start asking what would have to change first for change to be safe. So moving forward, we're going to do the same procedure we've done today. We're going to be talking about microtopics according to various lenses, particularly through the same four of the role and archetype being displayed in society as a sociological implication at the highest layer. That's the tip of the iceberg. The middle layer, second to that, is the psychological, which is impacting your environment and your experience. The third layer is the neurological implication, like genetics and development. And the fourth is the cognitive physics substrate and systematized way of understanding. All these are coincide. They work together in tandem. And when you have an understanding of all these, you're able to conquer your fears. You're able to move forward. You're able to have compassion for others, precision for yourself when it comes to reaching your next levels. Tomorrow is the release of our first video on our YouTube channel, along with our first class in the school curriculum. I advise you to please check them both out if you can. And of course, as always, be the best you can be. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you soon here at Jaxlabs.